Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're in Game 4 of the 2021 World Chess Championships being held in Dubai between the defending champion Magnus Carlsen and the challenger Jan Nepo. Now, a fun fact or a sobering reminder of how classical chess can be sometimes: Magnus Carlsen has not won a classical game in the World Championships since 2016. 5 years. Now, they usually hold the World Championships every 2 years. Has been 3 years since the last one in 2018. 2018, remember, they played 12 games and they drew every single one of those games. Now, they did go on to tiebreakers and Magnus Carlsen won that, but he hasn't won a classical game in 5 years in the World Championships, that is. So he has the white pieces today. Game number 4. There's been 3 draws so far. We'll see if Magnus Carlsen can break through and get a victory, or if we have another draw, or if Nepo, with the black pieces, can get a victory and start to spice things up. So start out with e4, e5, knight f3, and then Nepo plays knight f6, getting into the Petrov defense. Magnus Carlsen plays knight takes on e5, and now Jan Nepo has an opportunity for a boom in chess history. Millions of players would play, stories, books would be written if he played knight to c6. The Stafford Gambit here would be incredible. Can he actually do it? I would name my next child after him if he did this. He decides not to. He decides to play the main line, and that's just d6, taking all the fun out of it. And the knight just comes back here to f3, and the players continue down the main line. Knight takes here on e4. Pawn to d4, pawn to d5, just solidifying this outpost here on e4. Bishop here to d3. Bishop here to d6. And typically in the main variation, this outpost is pretty annoying for white, so he'll look at things like pawn to c4, just to break up this pawn on d5 that's protecting it, castle on the king side, and then bring the rook over here to e1. Just more material attacking this knight so that white can get it off the board. If that doesn't work, he can always bring his knight here to c3 to exchange off the knights. So Magnus Carlsen continues by castling on the king side. Castle for Nepo as well. c4, as we talked about. c6 just says, hey, if you want to exchange, I can just replace that with my own pawn here. Rook to e1, bishop down to f5, adding another layer of protection on this e4 square. Usually a big point of focus in the Petrov defense, in the main line at least. Queen to b3. Always want to be looking to get your piece involved into the action. You always want to be thinking about where your opponent left some material or a defense behind. The bishop on c8, as soon as it came on line here with f5, it left behind this pawn here on b7. So Magnus Carlsen getting his queen involved into the action, controlling these central light squares, also attacking this pawn here on b7. So black, queen to d7, getting involved into the action, defending this bishop right here, but more importantly right away defending the pawn here on b7. So since none of those options work for Magnus Carlsen to remove this knight here on e4, doesn't want to just give up his bishop right away for it. Not a good trade, because then your opponent would have the bishop pair. Decided to go ahead and go with his last option, that is knight to c3. So we do have the exchange right here. Now the bishops come off the board. Queen takes on f5. Pawn takes here on c3. And then after b6, since the queen is no longer defending this pawn here on b6, or on b7, excuse me, that allows just some solid protection here, so the queen can't come up and threaten this rook here on a8, because the knight can't easily come here to c6. Doesn't necessarily want to bring it to some other squares like d7 right now. He doesn't have any great outpost options for that. So after b6 here, Magnus Carlsen decides to go ahead and get rid of his double pawns here on the c file. And now we see pawn take on d5 and then queen up to b5. So quite a bit of exchanging on the board. Magnus Carlsen in previous games has done everything he can to hold on to the bishop pair. In this game decides that's not going to be an option. Queen up to b5 really is attacking the square here on e8. He does have the threat of bringing his rook up to e8 with the protection from the queen right here. Black decides to go ahead and bring his queen to d7 to defend against that. Now, players that don't have the skill level as these players, they might look at this as a trap, just because like, hey, all of a sudden I can just take this free pawn here on d5, but obviously that would be a huge mistake because after the queen takes here, then bishop down to h2, check, and then the queen is going to fall. So after the knight takes here on h2, queen takes here on d5, this would be a disaster. Magnus Carlsen would lose the game. Shocking to no one, Magnus Carlsen does not fall for this simple trap here. Instead, he plays the move pawn to a4. Now, Nepo's in an interesting spot here. If he trades off the queens, it's definitely going to be more of a drawish game. But if he doesn't, he could put himself in a pretty awkward spot here as far as how he really continues. He decides to go for the option of just taking the queen here on b5. You know, he could try something like rook to d8. I don't necessarily know that he wants to bring his rook here to d8 and just protect it. So he decides to go for the more drawish line, but probably the more correct line, and that is queen takes here on b5. Pawn takes here, and then pawn a5. So this opens up an opportunity for an en passant. I think this is probably the best move from Magnus Carlsen as well. For newer chess players, it may look a little odd, but the pawn can actually take here on a6 for en passant. He only has one move and one move only that he can do that. Magnus Carlsen doesn't like that option. He decides to go with knight to h4, looking for an attack on the king side of the board. We see black play pawn to g6. I think this is pretty straightforward, just limiting the squares where the knight can go to. Knight really eyeing this f5 square right now. So the only real options that Magnus Carlsen has is to bring his knight back here to f3, which there's no reason that he would ever play h4 if that was his thought. And the other option is to push forward with his pawn here to g4 so he can swing his knight back here to g2. And then if it wants to come to f4, or e3, he has those options. So g4 is the move. Knight over here to d7, knight to g2, and then rook to c8. And black had a couple options here. He could have easily played knight to f6. So I like this option. His other option is just to play the rook to c8, attacking his backward pawn here on c3. This is also a semi-open file. You always want to put your rooks on semi-open files. So he does opt for this option. Now bishop to f4. We do see the exchange here on f4. Knight takes on f4. Rook comes down, takes this pawn here on c3. Knight takes the pawn here on d5. So really both sides just exchanging material here. Rook to d3, attacking the pawn. And this is an interesting spot for white. I think there's one clear move that white has. Magnus Carlsen finds this move, but I'm curious, go ahead and pause it and see if you can find white's next best move. So it does have the option of just playing something like rook to a4, defending this pawn here on d4. But instead, I like what Magnus Carlsen found, and it's rook to e7. You really got to think about your opponent's pieces and how you can remove them from the game as much as possible. This knight here on d7, it can't come to c5 or e5 because of the pawn here on d4. Can't come to f6, it would just fall to this knight here, and it can't come to b6, it's being blocked by its own pawn here, and it doesn't want to come back to b8 because it's then be blocking its own rook here. So the only option is f8, and so this does a good job of forcing the knight to move back, and then he can always still defend the pawn right now. But now this limits the squares that Nepo has as far as getting his knight involved into the game. A knight on f8 is not doing anything at all. So Magnus Carlsen definitely has a pretty good setup here, even though it's going to be difficult to turn this into a victory because his game plan is clear. He has a passed pawn here on the d file. He needs to push this up. Nepo just needs to hold on. He also has a passed pawn of his own here on the a file. If he can push that, that's his way to victory as well. So knight to f6, check. King to g7, wants to make sure it doesn't just play king to h8 and just let this pawn fall here on f7. So that's not going to happen. Knight to e8, check. King comes back here. Pawn to d4, d5, as we talked about, his only option is to push that. Pawn to a4, knight to f6. Obviously, it would be a disaster if the rook took, because then just knight to f6 check, and that would fork the rook right here. So while it may look like, yeah, Magnus Carlsen is just going to lose this pawn, he is not going to. So pawn to a4, at least not yet. So knight to f6. The king moves g5, so now defending this knight here on f6. We see the pawn push forward here to a3. It almost now looks like Nepo has the best possibility to push this pawn forward. I think Magnus Carlsen realized the same thing. Knight to e8. And now we see a twofold repetition, and then both sides decide to draw. Magnus Carlsen tried his best, realized there was no way for him to push this pawn, saw the threat here on a3, and realized this is not going to end well. As soon as the pawn comes down here to a2, then Nepo has the move rook to d1. And then after the rook takes, he can just promote down here to a1, and then he has the support from the rook. So that would not end up well for Magnus Carlsen. Decide, yeah, I'll just go ahead and take the draw. And so after 4 games, 5 years still going, Magnus Carlsen does not have a win in classical chess in the World Championships. But it was still an entertaining game. I thought we were going to see something magical with the Petrov defense, maybe the Stafford Gambit. Obviously, I wasn't fully expecting that, but oh my gosh, would it have been exciting. Nepo would have been my favorite player of all time. Also would have just spiced up this World Championship a little bit. So we will be back tomorrow for game number 5, and then we take a break. Remember, they're on 3 days, take a break, 2 days on, take a break, and then go and repeat that same process as well. So thank you guys so much for watching. I know many of you are looking for the wins. I am too, but I am just the messenger, have to report the games as they take place. So thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.